All right, so morning everyone. My name is Frank Hoang. I'm from the University of California, Berkeley, which is not what it says on my name tag. So if you're a little confused, if you're from Cal Poly Slow and you don't recognize me, don't be alarmed. And my collaborators are listed as follows, and I have here today with me, you've already met Tressa, Michael, and one of our main PIs that we worked with was Dr. Shannon Siston, also of UC Berkeley as well. So I'm just going to quickly go over the introduction, so introduce you to the motivation behind our work. So mainly, the main point here is that we have more engineers, the need for engineers is increasing as we have our current workforce starting to retire going into retirement. But the problem is colleges are not graduating enough qualified engineers. Despite the fact that incoming freshmen still express a very high interest in STEM fields, we're seeing them not being able to persist for the duration of the undergraduate program. And so much work has been done to understand the traditional student persistence in engineering, but very little work exists on understanding how non-traditional engineering students would persist and what challenges come up that forces them to question whether or not they can persist in an engineering program. So I'm going to talk about the population. So Tressa's already talked about what adult non-traditional students are like, but I'll just quickly remind you that for our study, we studied those who were 25 years or older, and their characteristics of these students are they're financially independent, they may have dependents, they may also have part-time or even full-time employment. They might also enroll part-time academically, as opposed to most traditional students who are full-time enrolled in college. And lastly, most non-traditional students have a delayed entrance to college. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, so kind of lay down the foundation of what we know, so what we knew before we went into this work. So our work's built on multiple identity theory, and that basically says that a person's identity is not one-dimensional. It's very complex, and it's woven of these interconnected identities. And these identities are not all weighed equally. They fall into a hierarchy, so there's definitely a ranking, a weighing of importance. There are some identities that may be more important, and some identities that are not as important. And it depends on the individual circumstance. And I'll transition over to and how this affects the non-traditional student learning experience. So adult students are more likely to have these multiple conflicting identities. And due to these responsibilities that come with being adults with more responsibilities than the typical traditional college student, it makes them harder for them to relate and interact, and most importantly, understand their traditional student peers, who usually have a limited identity because at this point, their only concern is really about being a student. They don't have to deal with a lot of the responsibilities that non-traditional students usually have to deal with. Current efforts, however, are generalizing traditional student studies to the whole population. What I mean by that is, right now, a lot of institutions, they do all these studies and research studies apply to traditional students, and they apply their conclusions and findings to the entire population, not considering the fact that non-traditional students are unique and different from the traditional student population. And this oversight has led to the fact that non-traditional students are twice as likely to drop out of engineering undergraduate programs compared to their traditional peers. So in terms of persistence, what affects persistence, you might be wondering? There's two main ones that I'd like to highlight: academic integration and social integration. Some other secondary factors would be teaching and facilities, prior qualifications, individual circumstance. But I'd like to focus on academic and social integration because those are the two factors that have been seen as the most significant factors in persisting in an undergraduate engineering program. Academic integration usually defines how a student is performing grades-wise, their personal development in the academic classroom, and their academic self-esteem, so how confident they feel with the material. Social integration, on the other hand, depends on whether they've been making friends, and this might be friends with their peers in non-traditional peers or even their traditional student peers. Social integration has been shown to be very important in persistence for non-traditional students, while for traditional students, academic integration is most important. Non-traditional students usually don't have to worry too much about being academically integrated because for them, most of them are coming from a background where once they enter college, they were strongly committed. They left their structured lifestyles that they may have had before going to college, and they basically had to buy into the fact that they need to go to college. They have a goal. They have a set of goals and motivations. While traditional students, some of them have been observed to see as, well, I'm just going to college to get a degree, and they don't have these motivations and inspirations that a lot of our non-traditional students have. Let me go back real quick and just define what social integration is. So the current situation with social integration with non-traditional students is that they have limited opportunities to socialize with their peers. And why is that? Why is that the case? Well, I'll just bring it back to the point where they have multiple identities, which means they have multiple responsibilities. So their time is limited, and they don't have as much time as their traditional student peers to interact or even really speak to their peers, because there's not much room for relatability because their circumstances are quite different. So the methods I'm going to go into are the methods of this study. So the main goal was to understand differences in identities at 3 different institutions. And we're looking at the responsibilities of non-traditional students. So what other roles did they play besides just going to school? And also we wanted to underline absences of identities at each institution. So let's just say, for example, we studied 3 institutions. So a community college, which we abbreviated as COM, a small private university, which we abbreviated as PRI, and a large public university, which we abbreviated as PUB. We wanted to understand, okay, at COM, PRI, and PUB, what kind of students, what kind of non-traditional students go there? So what do most of these students, what kind of responsibilities do they have? But also identify what kind of students are missing from these institutions. And our participants were engineering undergraduate students. They were 25 years old or older, and they had prior engineering work experience. So just to list out, this is pretty much the same data that Tressa presented, in the sense that we had 5 participants in PRI, 8 participants in PUB, and 9 participants in COM. The numbers are off by about a factor of 1 because we decided to not include one of the participants for this study. So instruments. So we used a semi-structured 1-hour interview, and we asked questions about identities, motivations, and future plans. And what I mean by semi-structured is we had a set of questions, but we also followed up based on the responses that we were given. Most importantly, participants were asked to generate a list of 10 nouns. So these nouns, they were asked to list 10 nouns that describe them, and we asked them to rank it in order of importance. So what I mean by that is the noun that they ranked first would be the noun that best describes who they were. So in order 1, 2, 3 through 10, those are the top 10 nouns that truly capture the responsibilities and personalities of these non-traditional students. Once we had the audio recorded these interviews and then transcribed them and then analyzed them using thematic analysis and a multiple identity theory. At the end, we had an optional demographic survey so that we could try to see what demographic differences there were among the 3 institutions. So in terms of analysis, so I've already gone over, but like I said, best describing noun was ranked first, and you'll see in the next slide that I'll be talking about top scoring noun categories. So for example, these noun identity categories could be the following. So these are the top 5 that we saw that came up the most often was academic. So an example of what would fall into an academic identity category would be if they said that they were a student or an engineering student, anything related to an academic identity or responsibility. And so if the categories that scored the highest meant that more participants were ranking these nouns in the top half of their list. So the top scoring categories are composed of nouns that participants ranked more important than others. So demographic results. So from our comparison, we saw that PUB students had a very academic-centric lifestyle. So everything that they did was built around being able to focus on school 100%. So all of our pub participants were all full-time. So we don't have any part-time students. They're fully invested into this program. None of them had full-time employment, so at most they had part-time employment, probably to support themselves financially to some degree. The majority of pub participants were single, and none had children. With PRI, we see that participants were all employed. So we're starting to see that they're moving away from this full investment, that their life isn't entirely centered around their academics. The 60% of them, so a majority of them, were full-time students. And we had a very diverse response of relationship status and number of children. With COM, we had a majority of them were full-time students. We had some students that were employed, while if we had, of the participants that were student parents, most of them only had one dependent. So noun results. So by looking at the nouns, we're trying to understand what kind of students attend these different types of institutions. This goes back to the idea of social integration. Social integration happens when you're able to be around peers that you can relate to, and that means relate to demographically, relate through your experiences, through your responsibilities. So we want to look at these nouns and try to construct kind of a profile of what these participants at each institution, what kind of responsibilities they may have. So with pub, the top 3 scoring categories, the most important things that come to mind when we interviewed these participants was the nouns were related to their character traits, their engineering character traits, and their family. So you'll see that through pub, PRI, and COM, character traits come up as the top scoring categories, and that makes sense because when you ask someone to describe themselves, the first thing that comes to mind is how they describe themselves. The lowest scoring categories that came up, so nouns related to being an engineer or being a romantic partner, were the lowest scoring. That being said, pub was the only institution where participants even brought up any nouns related to engineering. So they actually had some sort of identity with the engineering profession. And we see that character traits and their family and their engineering, so when I say engineering character traits, this can be we can allude to things like they feel like they're builders or they're analytical. So words that don't exactly describe engineers as in a professional sense, but kind of the responsibilities. So you can kind of interpret this as these pub participants are more so identifying as engineering students and less so as professional engineers. With COM, we have character traits, again, family and academic. So, and in contrast to that, the lowest noun categories that came up were romantic partner and hobbyist. So we see that we're starting to see hobbies and personal relationships kind of move in here with the COM participants. And this illustrates that they have a more well-rounded lifestyle. So they are, for them, in addition to academics, they also can recall their identity roles as romantic partners, so that could be husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or hobbyists, so whatever hobbies they may pursue. Off the top of my head, maybe wood carving, woodworking. With PRI, the top scoring categories were family and character traits, so you can see that academics was not in their top noun categories, and this is interesting because all the COM and pub, most of those participants, school is definitely something that comes up because they're students. Yet, with the lowest scoring categories, we see that PRI students score very low in hobby, like identifying nouns that relate to hobbies, or engineering character traits. And so they had the most even distributed identity scores, so that means that they identified nouns that fall into a very diverse category of identities. So they have a very balanced set of responsibilities, and they're not just solely focused on their academics. So the conflicting identities make being a student at a competitive university challenging because they need to keep up with their traditional student peers that have much fewer responsibilities. And the differences in the demographics can be partially explained by the kind of support services that are offered at each institution. What I mean by that is depending on what type of, how the support services are catered, we can see that the institution retains a very specific type of a non-traditional student. So with COM offers evening classes, so they're more accommodating for working students. So we do observe that we have students that have part-time and full-time employment. PRI offers evening degree programs, so it's also consistent with the fact that we see that some PRI participants also are full-time employees. While at Pub, there were no equivalent offerings, so they didn't have any evening classes at all. So that's consistent with the demographic that we found was there were no Pub students that were full-time employed. So the only way that they could have a job and go to school was if they had a part-time employment. No Pub students had any children, so this might be an indication that Pub may have an incompatible environment for student parents. So what I mean by that is they may have the services to support student parents, but they may not make it very accessible and friendly to student parents. So looking at using the nouns analysis as a lens for understanding the social makeup of each university, we see that family and character traits score highly, and this is consistent with the fact that people usually describe themselves through their traits. And the fact that one of the strongest and most long-standing identities is your identity in your family, because that's it's one of the identities that you start building from the earliest stage of your life. So family roles and character traits score highly in that. Those two things are consistent across all three institutions. But it's the differences in the identity categories that allow us to begin to try to distinguish each educational institution and how they cater to these non-traditional students. So with COM students, we have an even distribution of noun categories. So we can conclude that they have multiple responsibilities outside their academic obligations. COM students are typically at an early stage in their education, and they still have family and jobs to tend to. And the support system recognizes this, and it helps them support their multi-responsibility lifestyle. So we observed that a lot of participants informed us that the support services and counselors at COM, a community college, they definitely understand what kind of responsibilities that these students have to deal with. PRI, they see college as a professional obligation. So the top scoring noun category was romantic partner, which is different from all the other institutions. And so we can conclude that perhaps PRI's support services and how they structure their academic program allows students to have relationships and maintain their academic commitments at the same time. The lowest scoring came in hobbies and engineering character traits, so we can kind of conclude that most of these students are solely focused on their formal academic program, so they're just going to college to learn. They're not there to socialize or party or anything like that. They see college as a professional engagement and nothing else. Pub sees college as a lifestyle. So in order to attend Pub, it's a 4-year institution, and you need to be able to commit yourself fully. So they can't be employed full-time. Anything else has to be part-time and secondary to the academic commitments. So what we would say about this is Pub needs to tailor its environment to accept students who have other responsibilities besides their academics. So in conclusion, our goal of our study was to investigate across multiple institutions what personal identities that students take and develop methodologies to improve retention of non-traditional engineering students. Despite their responsibilities outside of school, we find that non-traditional students are fully committed to their schooling, just like their traditional student peers. So some recommendations we would make based on our research, we would recommend that there be an establishment of evening classes, student parent centers, and more student parent friendly policies. And this can be spread across all 3 institutions. Student health insurance should allow for dependent coverage so that it makes it more accommodating for students that have dependents to go back to school and not have to worry about paying those extra premiums for their families. There needs to be better awareness about such programs and support services. So one of the most important findings that we made was even though there were support services, a lot of these non-traditional students were not aware of the fact that these existed. Lastly, we advocate that there should be an establishment of non-traditional student communities to bring together all these students that they might not be able to relate to their traditional peers, but we should unite them so that they don't feel alone and feel invisible to the entire population, because at these colleges, the populations are so large that sometimes they just feel lost in the college classroom. So I'd like to acknowledge that our work was supported by the National Science Foundation by the following grants. I'd like to thank Dr. Amelito Enriquez for partnering with us, as well as our 4 advisory members. And that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? Yeah. So the way we did it was we just mass flyered them and emailed them. So we asked specifically for students that were 25 years and older and had a prior engineering work experience, so it significantly narrowed the population that we had. So we essentially interviewed every single participant that met that criteria. The participants. So we'd send out flyers and they would reach out to us, and then we would reply back to them and see if they qualified based on what we were looking for.